I believe that we all long for honesty and authenticity, but also there are some reasons why we aren't able to fully live that out. There are reasons why not fully going there all of the time can be convenient, it can be comfortable. And yet I think there's something very profound that happens when a community, or even just in your relationships, when we decide to create this space for you and for another or for an entire community to show up as our full selves. Now, what's interesting that happens at that point is that we're taking a risk because we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. We're not sure what's going to come up with that kind of invitation. And yet, with that level of risk, I think there's something inherently spiritual that when I think of that word spirituality, I think about getting beneath the surface, getting to the depths of who we are. And so I think it's very much worth the risk. Because at our deepest self, I think we want to know one another and be fully known for who we are. We want to go behind the facade that we see dominating our collective life within society, within social media, and even just face-to-face interactions. It's so easy to get caught up in this curated, manicured, inauthentic sense of self that we present to one another. And yet we're all pretty good judges of when this is happening. We all know inauthenticity. We can sniff it out. And it's not just with other people. There's also this sense of superficial depth when it comes to companies, when it comes to advertisements. I often get this sense that companies are trying to basically convince you that they're your best friend, that they love you, but really they just want your money. Some examples that I was thinking about this week about companies, and really these strong examples of really trying to give you this sense that they're your best friend, creating this superficial depth. I was reminded of course, how can you forget Olive Garden? When you're here, your family. It just made me think, really? Family? Can I crash on your couch, Olive Garden? Can I borrow a 50 if you know what, can I get $50? Or State Farm. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. How many of you have had a better neighbor than State Farm? I want my neighbor to bring me blueberries. I don't want my neighbor to charge me premiums. Or this one I was thinking, L'Oreal, because you're worth it. I know I'm worth it. I don't need shampoo to tell me that. I found this new one. I didn't realize this was a slogan for Reebok. Be more human. I've been human for 30 years, and I've never done that maneuver. Lastly, in my searches and in my discovery this week, I found a Korean barbecue sauce called We Love You. You don't even know me, okay? But yet with all these examples, I think what we see is this attempt at giving you this sense that, oh, you're loved. But as Tim Keller says, to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. Yet to be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. Now, Tim Keller was a Christian theologian who passed away last year, and yet this quote, I think, it transcends the Christian tradition. I think what's really being said here, and what I find fascinating, is that when we approach community, and this idea of building authentic relationships, it's almost as if we are modeling it after a divine love. So if the word God works for you, great. If not, if you want to use another word, maybe the universe, at a certain level, we can look at ourselves and recognize that at a certain level of reality, we are known and loved, whether it's loved by God or maybe embraced by the universe. And so when we come into these spaces, we're attempting to create community. We could almost look at it as though we're trying to recreate a divine love, an unconditional love that already exists, and we're trying to build it with one another. But that is an incredibly tall order, to be fully known in our diversity, fully known in our humanity, fully known in our fallibility. And so This is why it's really a journey that we go on as individuals and a journey that we go on as a community. And that's the heart of this series, True Community, is going on that journey together. And in this series, we're drawing from some themes that come from a book called A Different Drum by the author M. Scott Peck. We talked about this last week, and really, Peck gives this view of community going on this journey throughout these 4 stages. It's a model of stages. And the stages go like this. We start in pseudo-community, and from pseudo-community you move into chaos. From chaos you move into emptiness, and from emptiness we're able to create true community. Now, today, and throughout this series, we're going to kind of unlock what each of these mean. But today, we're simply going to be talking about the movement from pseudo-community into chaos. And yet, I believe that this simple movement is so powerful for not just our communities, but our relationships and even our understanding of ourselves, that if this is the only message that you catch throughout this whole series, I'm so glad you're here, because I think that there's so much depth that we can unlock just in this movement. Another thing, too, I want to be clear, when we look at stages, any kind of model of growth, whether it's stages of faith or even the hero's journey, we all kind of are familiar with a sort of a model that looks at personal growth, collective growth in terms of moving along different stages. And I just want to be clear, this is just a label, and it's just language that can be helpful for us, but it's not the be-all, end-all. It doesn't cover every aspect of the human experience. It's also not a one-and-done thing. It's not that we just go through this journey one time and it's all done. We're often called to revisit different aspects that we've already gone through. Like when you think about your spiritual journey, how many of you would say, yeah, I'm always kind of relearning, revisiting themes that I thought I was already, things I'd already figured out, stages that I felt like I'd already gone through, but we're constantly revisiting. It's not exactly linear. And lastly, when we think about these stages, I hope that rather than thinking of it in this fixed way, you'll just see that, hey, these are just some ways that we tend to show up in community. These are just some ways that we show up when we're trying to build relationships with one another. And so we start with pseudo-community. And I just want to say right off the bat, the name sounds a little intimidating. It sounds negative based on the name. But really, there's something incredibly valuable about this first stage, because whenever we're engaging in some kind of work that involves stages, to show up at stage 1 is to still show up and to still say, hey, I'm trying to do something here. And so I want to just say that if you're looking at your own life and you're saying, hey, maybe I'm trying to engage in community, or I'm trying to build community, and I'm still just learning, and I'm still in what feels like the early stages, the fact that you've showed up to that work is commendable. And so in pseudo-community, we are showing up to the work of community. We're trying to do what we talked about last week, which is to build a space where people of different opinions, different life experiences can come together and let their differences actually make one another better, to find spaces to heal within community. And this is really valuable because this is happening in pseudo-community. The only problem, the only shortcoming in that first stage of community is that there is this desire to remain conflict-free. Peck says this: pseudo-community is conflict avoiding. True community is conflict resolving. And there's an important distinction here. See, we know that conflict in our life is inevitable, but we are given that choice. Are we going to rise up and meet it, or are we going to try to figure out how we can just avoid it? And so when you look at your life, when you think about either the communities that you're a part of, the friendships that you have, the relationships with your family, ask yourself, are you avoiding conflict or are you resolving conflict? And if you can figure that out, whichever of those it is, whichever of those drives that relationship or that community, it's a good indication on whether or not you were in this stage of pseudo-community. So think about a friendship that you might have, for example. Maybe you would say, yeah, this friendship, it's not super deep, Maybe this friendship is more or less a surface level friendship. And yeah, what's great about it is we don't really have any conflict. But there's also maybe some level in which you would say, I don't know if that person really, truly knows me. And say that that person at some point or another has or will offend you, or say something that they didn't realize it struck you the wrong way, or maybe they crossed a line. And at that point, you might have said to yourself, well, I'm just going to assume that they really didn't mean anything by it. And, so in that case, I'm not going to say anything. It's just not worth it. It's not worth it to get into some kind of conflict. But by not speaking up at that moment, you're withholding from them the opportunity to know you further. You're withholding from them the opportunity to engage in a deeper conversation, and you're ultimately keeping that relationship within pseudo-community. Or think about your relationships with family. For many of us, we spent time with family during the holidays, and many families have, that thing that you avoid talking about, the elephant in the room, the thing that everyone just tries to avoid so we can stay on the surface and keep things relatively comfortable. And yet our friend Rob Bell would say this: it's that thing that you can't talk about. It's the elephant in the room that actually holds all of the power. It's that thing that's sucking up all the energy, and it's that thing that keeps us in pseudo-community. So when you think about in your life, in your relationships, that unspoken pain, the unspoken grief, the unspoken truth, think about all the energy it takes to keep that inside. I think about our hearts like a flowing river, and our most deepest authentic self is just flowing with who we are. It's just allowed to be what it is naturally. And yet we come in, and so often we dam up that river. We tell ourselves what should and shouldn't be said because we want to avoid conflict. We want to avoid uncomfortable situations. And so in our efforts to avoid an external disruption, we actually cause an internal disruption within. I think about my own story. I grew up in the evangelical megachurch, and from a pretty young age, it became my career and my path through life. And yet in my early 20s, I began to have this experience in which my faith and my view of reality began to really be turned upside down and become expanded more and more, until my views of God really couldn't be contained within the spiritual container that I was handed in the particular religious tradition that I grew up in. And yet, though it was giving me so much joy and excitement to have my view of the world blown up, it was also this experience of cognitive dissonance, because I would stand on stage and I might have appeared comfortable in my skin, or I might have appeared to believe all the things that I was saying, but then I would walk off stage and I'd feel like I was a fraud. I would feel like I'm not truly known and loved for who I am in this moment, for how I'm actually showing up, because if they knew about these doubts, they wouldn't be able to handle it. And the truth is the reason why I stayed in that uncomfortable space is because it was my career path. And sometimes we desire stability. Sometimes we choose things like money over authenticity. If we look at our lives, we would, if we're being honest, we would probably say that there are spaces in which inauthenticity has actually been convenient. That to remain inauthentic has somewhat allowed us to have a somewhat comfortable experience within a particular relationship. And so when we think about this word pseudo-community, when we think about maybe the churches we've been a part of, the family relationships we've had, the friendships we've had, or even our own relationship to ourself, think about how that inauthenticity has been comfortable. It's been convenient. And I think churches are one of those communities that are especially prone to getting stuck in this place of pseudo-community, because to invite conflict rather than to avoid it might end up challenging the narrow view of God that is held in that type of community. And often conflict is avoided using that view of God, because if you say, hey, our view of God, our view of the divine needs to line up, needs to look identical to one another, that can actually help you avoid a certain measure of conflict. But for our community and communities like us, we don't necessarily have that luxury because really from the outset, we've invited diversity in our spirituality, diversity in our views of God. And that's something that I love and celebrate about our community, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't conflict avoidant. This is why I want to go through this journey. And this is why I want to have the humility to say, hey, what can we learn by looking at these different stages? What would it be like if we really said, hey, how are we avoiding conflict? And how can we stop avoiding conflict? And see, what happens is the moment that we are aware, the moment that we say, hey, maybe there are ways in which we've been this pseudo-community, that's when we're brought into that second stage of chaos community. Now, when I say that word chaos, I'm sure for many of us, we might have this sort of negative view of that word. That word chaos means I'm not in control, or that word chaos means I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't like that. But in the context of community, the alternative to chaos is staying in our safe bubble, is staying on the surface, and I don't think that's what we want. Peck says chaos is not just a state, it is an essential part of the process of community development. In the stage of chaos, individual differences are, unlike those in pseudo-community, right out in the open. There's a point in our lives, there's a point in community where things get messy, where we're offended, where we're failed, where conflict arises, where uncomfortability makes itself known, and that which we've been able to avoid for a certain amount of time eventually becomes unavoidable. And at this point, there's this kind of draw to move backwards, to just kind of escape that conflict, and yet that's what keeps you stuck in pseudo-community, and it's why so many communities never leave that stage. But if we choose to move forward, if we choose to be brave and go ahead and embrace that uncomfortability, there's something beautiful on the other side. So it's that moment in that friendship where, yes, they offended you, yes, they crossed a line, and you are actually able to share with them, hey, that made me feel a certain way, hey, I need to talk to you. And it's a risk to say the thing that you're avoiding saying. But yet, and it's true, like maybe they won't be able to handle it. Maybe your worst fear of, oh, how are they going to react? Maybe they're not going to react in a favorable way. But at least then you would know. At least the truth would be there. But in all honesty, it's probably just as likely that they're going to react in a way that would surprise you, that you can have this opening and that this confrontation would actually lead to a further depth and intimacy. Or it's that experience with your family where you just decide, you know what, I'm just going to stop avoiding conflict. And we all have different families, of course, and so there's no one way to do this. But it's that moment when you choose to break that dam and to stop limiting yourself. Because if we don't do that, we don't have any hope of actually being known. But of course, this is an incredibly scary thing to do. Recently, I had an experience with someone in my family where I basically said, look, I want to have authentic relationship with you. And I think the only way for us to move forward is to actually acknowledge right now we're not okay. Right now, the dynamic between us has not been working. But I'm saying this, and I know it's uncomfortable. I'm saying this because I think this is the path forward. Deep down, I think we all know that chaos and its unpredictability and its risk is still preferable to living on the surface. It's still preferable to avoiding our truth. And in fact, chaos has incredible creative power. Jung said this, in all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order. Anais Nin said, in chaos there is fertility. Deepak Chopra says, all great changes are preceded by chaos. And Nietzsche said, you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. Look at the cosmos. Look at the formation of galaxies and planets. Chaos was not the end of a world, but chaos is actually the beginning of something new. Robert Drake said, "Look deeper through the telescope and do not be afraid when the stars collide towards the darkness, because sometimes the most beautiful things begin in chaos." And our spiritual teachers, those from the great spiritual traditions, I think they were unafraid of a little chaos. Like, how many of us remember when the Buddha said that the path to awakening was just to be polite and to avoid conflict? Or how many of us remember when Gandhi said, if you really want to change the world and change society, just make sure not to ruffle any feathers. Make sure to just kind of keep playing along with the status quo. Or how many of us remember that those verses in the Gospels when Jesus just continued to remind us, be nice, be polite. No, actually, here's the opposite of that. In Luke 12:49-53, Jesus says, "I've come to start a fire on this earth. How I wish it were blazing right now. I've come to change everything, turn everything right side up. How I long for it to be finished. Do you think I came to smooth things over and make everything nice? Not so. I've come to disrupt and confront. From now on, when you find 5 in a house, it will be 3 against 2 and 2 against 3, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against bride and bride against mother-in-law." Some of you probably especially relate to that last line. Now, if we look at Jesus' life and we look at the fact that he chose death over actual physical, literal violence, then we don't necessarily need to look at this passage in a literal context, but we can see it as a beautifully poetic source of language in which he's saying, hey, if you want to bring out a new way of being in the world, a new way of relating to one another, it's naturally going to destabilize the old, and you have to confront that. Sometimes you need to have a disruption or a de-centering that actually serves a greater center. Like Jung said, within the disorder, there is a greater order. So when I look at my own journey of inauthenticity and getting to this point where I realized, okay, I can't move forward as a human being if I'm living this inauthentically. So I ended up, leaving that aspect of my career and leaving the evangelical megachurch. And there was a time and a period in my life that was very chaotic because I just didn't know what the path forward was going to look like. And yet I'm so glad that I went through the chaos because it brought me to Aldea. It brought me to my people. It brought me to a place where I can feel more authentic than I ever have in my life. And also the people who were with me in my journey before, they've been able to see my authenticity here and now. And for most, if not all of them, they've been able to support that. And so I'm grateful it was the chaos that actually brought me where I truly wanted to go. Yet I can't promise that that journey will always be safe. No, in fact, you're probably going to get hurt in some ways. I can't promise that that journey isn't going to cost you anything. I can't promise that it's always going to be fun or easy. But I believe at my core that we were meant for a deep sort of belonging that isn't going to happen if we just keep playing it safe. But how do we do this? How do we actually practically embrace chaos? Recently, I've made a new friend. He's someone who is pastoring a church a lot like Aldea in North Carolina, and he's nearing retirement, and so he's been really sharing just a lot of wisdom with me and how he's built his community. And so, I've asked him and I've said, how is it that you really reach this point of deep, authentic community, deep belonging, deep relationships? And he said, and I quote, and remember, I'm paraphrasing, and he said that we really reached authentic community when we started talking about our shit. Again, I'm paraphrasing, I'm quoting. But it really was this profound understanding for me of this realization that it's actually when we get beneath that facade, we get beneath that curated exterior, and we start to really be with one another in our pain, in our brokenness. The next time you see someone and they say, hey, how's it going? Happy Sunday. How are you? You have my permission to say, not good. I'm doing terrible, because that's at least closer to a source of vulnerability, to truth. Friends, when the next time that you're in an uncomfortable situation, the next time you're in conflict, the next time you're noticing differences arise between you and someone else in this community or elsewhere, I would encourage you, what if instead of avoiding that, what if you could be curious about what it might be that you can learn from this interaction? Or what is it that you can let go of in order to allow you to communicate more deeply with this person? And that's really what we're going to be talking about next week. And that's what that next stage of emptiness is it's this invitation to see, for all that chaos has brought up within us, what then can we let go of and surrender in service of greater communication? I want to close with this. The word for crisis in Chinese is this, and it's two characters, and it's two words. It's wei ji. And that first word, wei, means danger. Of course, right? Crisis, danger. But it's that second word that's a little bit of a surprise. And that second word, ji, means a crucial point when something begins to change. That word crisis is really a combination of the word danger and the word opportunity. Yes, if we risk vulnerability, there's some danger there, but there's also an opportunity there. Yes, if we just let our differences be differences without trying to change another person, yeah, there's some danger there, but there's also an incredible opportunity. There's a crucial moment when things begin to change. And so I just encourage you, when you look at your lives, as you move forward from here today and you go out into your workplaces and your different communities, I'd encourage you to be unafraid to invite a little crisis. We've all experienced some kind of crisis. Like, I'm sure many of you have experienced a midlife crisis. I've seen your sports cars, so... Or there are times when we have existential crises or dark nights of the soul. And today, as we talk about this crisis of community, the question I'd ask you is this: what crisis are you willing to endure? What chaos are you brave enough to embrace? Are you brave enough to go through in order to experience deeper authenticity, deeper belonging, truer relationships on the other side?